As these things often do, it all began innocently. My husband Jack and I had been married for almost 10 years, and life had settled into a nice routine. Jack's nephew Remy had just graduated from college and was looking for a job to save money. Jack suggested that he stay with us for a few weeks while he decided what to do next. I didn't think much of it at the time. Remy was always the quiet one at family gatherings. He was polite but distant, and even though he's now in his mid-20s, he still had that boyish charm. At first, having Remy around the house didn't cause too many problems because he was polite, stayed out of our way, and spent most of his time job hunting. I would sometimes run into him in the kitchen or while he was relaxing in the living room, but our interactions were short because I was busy with my own life, my job, keeping the house in order, and maintaining. A few weeks into Remy's stay, something changed. It was a rainy Sunday afternoon, and Jack had gone out to meet some friends. I was alone in the house with Remy, who was reading quietly on the couch in the living room. I remember the moment very well. I walked in to get a book and saw him looking up at me with eyes that lingered just a bit too long. There was a spark that I hadn't expected and hadn't felt in a long time. I told myself it was nothing, but as the days went by, I started to notice small changes in Remy's behavior. He would find reasons to be in the same room as me, like asking for help with his job search or offering to do my chores. His compliments became more personal, and his presence, which had been neutral before, started to feel charged. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it or if there was something real going on between us that we weren't saying. Soon Jack started working later and later, leaving Remy alone in the house for long periods of time. Each day I became more aware of his presence and the tension building in the air. It was like the house itself had started to hum with an energy that neither of us could ignore. We never touched or said anything inappropriate, but the silence between us grew thicker with each hour. One evening after Jack had gone out again, Remy and I found ourselves in the kitchen together. As I passed him the ingredients for dinner, we brushed hands, and I realized that this wasn't just a harmless attraction. Something dangerous was growing between us, and I wasn't sure I was ready to face it. "Thank you," I said, trying to sound casual as I handed him a plate. "You've been really helpful around the house." Remy smiled, that same boyish grin I'd seen 100 times before, but this time it felt different. "It's nothing," he said, his voice soft. "I like being around you." I didn't know how to respond. The air between us felt thick, almost suffocating, and I realized for the first time how close we had come to crossing a line we could never uncross. Anyway, after that night in the kitchen, I started to notice Remy more. His presence in the house, which had been easy to ignore, seemed almost magnetic. I told myself I wasn't being serious because he was my husband's nephew, but the more I tried to convince myself that nothing was going on, the more I felt drawn to him. Jack, who had no idea that Remy and I were getting along, kept working late. When he wasn't home, the silence felt less like peace and more like temptation. Remy and I still kept things polite and casual on the surface, but there was always an unspoken undercurrent that threatened to pull us under. Things didn't start to go badly until the weekend. Jack had to go on an overnight work trip, leaving me alone with Remy again. I had planned to hang out with some friends, but they had to cancel at the last minute, leaving me feeling restless and on edge. Remy could tell that I wasn't feeling well and suggested we watch a movie together. I hesitated because it felt like crossing a line, even though it was only a movie. I didn't want to seem paranoid or awkward, so I agreed. We sat on the couch next to each other in the living room with the TV shining in front of us. At first, it was easy to focus on the movie, but as the minutes went by, I became more aware of how close we were sitting, his arm brushing against mine as he reached for the remote, and I could hear the soft sounds of his breathing. Halfway through the movie, I felt him move closer, and my heart started to race. I told myself to get up and leave the room, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed still as the space between us disappeared. Remy said in a low voice, "I've been feeling pretty lost lately, but being around you makes me feel like everything will be okay." I didn't know what to say because his words were sincere and vulnerable, which caught me off guard. I wanted to comfort him and reassure him that everything would be okay, but I also knew I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous. "You've been through a lot," I said. "It's normal to feel uncertain right now." He looked at me with dark, intense eyes and said, "It's more than that. I don't know how to explain it, but I've never felt this way before." My breath caught in my throat. This was the moment I had been dreading and looking forward to at the same time. I knew I had to shut it down to create distance before things went too far, but instead I found myself. Remy was frozen, unable to speak or move, but his face was inches from mine. The tension in the air between us felt more intimate than any physical contact could have. I broke the moment abruptly, saying, "I need to check on something in the kitchen." Remy blinked briefly, surprised, but then nodded. Of course, I'll pause the movie. I rushed out of the living room, my mind racing with what I was doing and how I had let things get this far in the kitchen. I grabbed the edge of the counter to steady my breathing. I needed to regain control of the situation before it got out of hand, but even as I stood there trying to calm down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the line we had been so careful to toe was about to be crossed, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to stop it. I stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed to, rearranging the dishes, wiping down the counter, and doing other things to avoid going back into that room. My mind was racing with different emotions that I couldn't quite put my finger on: guilt, fear, and something else I couldn't quite name. How had I let this happen? More importantly, what was I going to do about it? Eventually, I realized I couldn't hide any longer. I took a deep breath, calmed down, and walked back into the living room. Remy was sitting on the couch. I had left him standing straight, but when I walked in, he looked up and gave me a small, almost sorry smile. "I'm sorry if I made you feel uncomfortable," he said quietly. His words hung in the air between us, and I could tell he was waiting for some kind of reassurance, some sign that everything was okay. But the truth was that I wasn't sure if everything could be okay after this. We were both standing on the edge of something, and the question was whether one of us would step back or fall. "I just think we need to be careful," I finally said, choosing my words carefully. "We're both in a tough spot right now, and it's easy to get confused." Remy looked down at his hands, and his face couldn't be read. "I didn't mean to make things complicated. It's just that I've always felt like I could talk to you like you understand me in a way that no one else does," he whispered. That confession caught me off guard. I hadn't realized how deeply he felt, and his words made me feel something, but I couldn't let myself think about how wrong this was. There was no way this could go any further than it did. "Remy, you're Jack's nephew," I said in a firmer voice. "We can't do this. Whatever it is, it can't happen." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at me for what seemed like forever, as if he were looking for something in my eyes. Finally, he slowly nodded, acknowledging the truth. "We both knew, but hadn't said it out loud yet. You're right," he said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." I felt relieved, but then I felt a sudden stab of sadness. Part of me wanted him to fight and argue to make me feel like this connection we had was more than just a mistake, but I knew that would have been a lie. And I knew that we sat in silence for a while, the tension between us still high, but with a different tone. And understanding that this was the time we had to make a choice. In that quiet space, with the movie still paused on the screen, it was clear that the choice had already been made. Finally, getting up and avoiding his gaze, I said, "I think I'm going to bed. It's late. And we both had a long day." Remy nodded again, but didn't say anything as I turned and walked away. As I climbed the stairs, I could feel his eyes on my back, but I didn't look back because I didn't want to lose the little control I had regained. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened that night in my mind. There were times when it felt like I was in a movie instead of my own life, but I knew I had to let it go for the sake of my marriage and my sanity. I had to bury this before it got much worse, but I couldn't sleep because I couldn't get rid of the feeling that Remy and I's story wasn't over. The days after that night felt strange, like I was living in a parallel reality where nothing had changed on the surface, but everything felt different underneath. Remy and I tried to avoid each other as much as possible. When we did run into each other, we greeted each other in a polite but awkward way, acting like the tension between us didn't exist. But it was always there, like a storm waiting to break. Jack came back from his trip the next day, blissfully unaware of what had happened while he was gone. He slid back into our normal routine as if nothing had changed, and in some ways nothing had. Remy, on the other hand, seemed quieter than usual and spent most of his time at job interviews or a nearby coffee shop working on his resume. Part of me was glad for the distance because it gave me time to think about what had almost happened, but another part of me, the part one didn't want to admit, missed him and how intense our relationship had been, even if it had never turned physical. A few days later, I found myself alone in the house again because Jack was working late and Remy had gone out, or so I thought. When I heard the front door quietly close, my heart skipped a beat. Remy was back. I wasn't sure what I expected or what I wanted. All I knew was that I wasn't ready for another fight right now. I was about to sneak upstairs when Remy appeared in the doorway. His expression was blank. "We need to talk," he said in a low but firm voice. I nodded, my stomach twisting in knots. I knew this conversation was going to happen, but I had been hoping to avoid it for a little longer. Remy walked into the living room and sat on the edge of the couch as if he didn't belong there. I sat across from him, keeping my distance. The silence between us was thick with unspoken words. I've been thinking a lot about what happened. Remy finally said, breaking the silence, I think I need to leave. The words hit me like a punch. I hadn't expected him to say that. Where would he go? Was this because of me? I didn't want you to feel like you had to leave, I quickly told Remy. You don't have to leave because of what almost happened. He finished my sentence, his eyes locked on mine. We both knew it was the right thing to do. I can't stay here pretending everything is fine when it's not. I've made things harder for you, and I need to take responsibility for that. His words were mature and thoughtful, and they made my chest tighten. He was right, of course. His presence in the house had turned into a ticking time bomb, and we both knew that sooner or later something would go off. The only way to calm things down was for one of us to leave. You're not responsible for everything, I said softly. We both played a part in this. Remy shook his head. Maybe, but I'm the one who made things harder for you. Jack trusts me, and I broke that trust. Hearing Jack's name was like a cold splash of water. It reminded me of the man who didn't know what was going on under his own roof. It really hit me hard, and I knew that Remy was making the right decision. As much as I wanted to believe that we could go back to how things were before, we couldn't. When are you leaving? I asked in a whisper. I have a friend in the city. Remy said I'll crash with him for a while until I figure things out. I'll tell Jack it's because I found a job opportunity there. It was a clean exit that would keep Jack from ever knowing how close we were to disaster, but as I listened to Remy explain his plan, I couldn't help but feel a huge sense of sadness. I'll miss having you around, I said, surprised by how honestly I felt. Remy gave me a small, sad smile. We both knew that this was the end of whatever had been building between us. There would be no dramatic goodbyes or last-minute confessions, just a quiet understanding that this was the right thing to do, even if it hurt. Remy stood up, and I followed him to the door. As he reached for the handle, he stopped and turned to face me one last time. I hope you'll be okay, he said softly. I will. I said, even though I wasn't sure if that was true. Remy then opened the door and walked out into the night, leaving behind the tension, temptation, and complicated mess we were about to get into. I watched him walk down the driveway and disappear into the shadows, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could finally breathe. When Jack came home later that night and kissed me on the cheek, he had no idea how much weight had been lifted from our lives. I smiled at him, knowing that what had almost happened would remain a secret and never be told. In the quiet of our home, I realized that we had all escaped something dangerous that could have changed everything.